Diabetes is about having too high glucose levels. But how is the blood glucose regulated? Let us now ask Professor Jens Juul Holst from the University of Copenhagen to explain the key aspects involved in maintaining normal blood glucose levels. Tell me more about this.
Yeah, it's actually a very interesting question, I think. And the problem is that we take in a lot of carbohydrates every day, and I will tell you a little bit about what we do with them afterwards. But the point is that in the body, we have a certain compartment, an amount of fluid, that's the fluid surrounding the cells. And that amounts in healthy people to about, let's say, 14 liters or something like that. And in that compartment, the concentration of glucose is about 5 millimoles per liter. That means we have 60 of those little millimoles in that compartment. But when we eat, we can easily take in something like 2,000 or 3,000 of those millimoles every day. And if they were dissolved in those 14 liters, we would have a tremendously high concentration of glucose, which would probably kill all of us very rapidly. Then, on the other hand, there are tissues that use the glucose also at a tremendous speed. The muscles, for instance, can empty that little pool of glucose within minutes. So if you do hard muscular work, the glucose will go away from that little pool and into the muscles where they will be burnt. And then the brain doesn't have any glucose and you will fall, you know. And that is the problem. So how do we maintain a constant level of glucose? Having too much is dangerous. Having too little is also dangerous. It must be right there in the middle at all times. And that's why we have the liver. The liver is the organ that can take up glucose or put out glucose. And that is regulated by another organ, which is called the pancreas, where we have the islets, small groups of cells. One cell produces insulin that puts glucose down. Another group of cells produces glucagon, which puts up glucose, and they do that via the liver. So we have this little sensing organ that feels, measures the glucose, and sends a message to the liver to either produce or take up glucose. And that's how we survive.
So what happens to the body if you have diabetes then?
See, that's another good question, because there's no doubt that the hyperglycemia of type 2 diabetes, this is what we're talking about right now, is due to an inadequate production of glucose in the liver. Now we can discuss why that is. It's not completely clear. It might be a good thing, because if there wasn't a high concentration of glucose out there, how would the tissues get the glucose to burn? But on the other hand, it's dangerous, because that is what causes all the problems of type 2 diabetes. That is the vascular damage, the neural damage, the organ damage, so that eventually you get all the complications, which really are the threat of type 2 diabetes. So it's a very, very important thing. So again, what makes the liver produce less or too much glucose? So I think one of the key problems here really is insulin, because insulin normally keeps glucose production in the liver down and uptake in the liver up. But when you have type 2 diabetes, the liver is not as sensitive to insulin as it normally is. And why does that happen? So if you build up lipids, fat in the liver, it becomes insensitive to insulin. And all of a sudden you have a situation where the insulin doesn't work as well as it should. And that means that the liver will, instead of take up glucose, will produce glucose. And that's why you have your high glucose levels. On top of that, there's no doubt that the cells that produce insulin suffer in type 2 diabetes. They cannot produce as much insulin as they should have done. So there's another defect here. So one is you get obese, ruin your liver. 2, you have a genetic defect that hits your insulin cells so that they cannot produce a sufficient amount of insulin. That's the problem.
What is the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes?
So type 1 is characterized by an immune attack on the beta cells that kills them. And that means you have fewer and fewer and fewer of the beta cells, and they can produce less and less insulin, and eventually you have a real problem where there's clearly too little insulin. You don't necessarily have to invoke any other mechanism than that. there's too little insulin, and that of course means that you cannot inhibit the liver any longer, that it will produce too much glucose, and that's where you have your hyperglycemia. There's another hormone there, glucagon, that helps somewhat to keep up that glucose production, because also that suffers. That's because of the lack of insulin, probably. But the insulin lack is the primary cause here, whereas with type 2, as we heard already, it's really the combination of a lifestyle that causes accumulation of fat at places where it shouldn't be, for instance in the liver. And then a genetic inability to produce sufficient amounts of insulin to cope with that problem.
As we've heard, regulating blood glucose is a very complex process. What happens within the pancreas, which is the organ that controls the secretion of insulin, is an ongoing discussion, because we do not actually know which exact mechanism causes insulin secretion failure in relation to diabetes. To better understand the cellular mechanisms within the insulin factory, let's ask Professor Steve Bloom to explain what triggers insulin secretion and what can go wrong in relation to diabetes.
The pancreas gland has something called the islets of Langerhans. Langerhans was a German scientist who pointed out there were these little tiny dot-like things in the gland, and these islets of Langerhans, because he described them, are the areas that produce the insulin. So it's these little tiny islets that produce the insulin. They don't just produce insulin, though that's their most important product by quite a margin. That's really critical. If you don't have insulin and you're not treated, you will die. So insulin's really critical. But also these islets produce several other hormones, to give them a few names: glucagon and somatostatin. Now, somatostatin causes growth to stop. Glucagon comes from the word glucose giving, and that acts in the opposite manner to insulin and helps you put up glucose. So if you haven't eaten for a while, you will secrete quite a bit of glucagon from your pancreas, and that'll stop you getting too low a sugar, which people who are starving could easily suffer from.
So whereas high blood glucose affects several of our organs, damages our cells, and may result in blindness, infections, kidney failure, and other chronic conditions, including premature death, very low blood glucose means we may lose consciousness and die. Even though in most cases diabetes involve insufficient insulin secretion or insulin-sensitive tissue becoming insulin insensitive, many variants of diabetes exist. In fact, there have been identified as many as 50 variants of the disease. The better known types of diabetes are called gestational diabetes and maturity onset diabetes of the young. And although these types of diabetes are less known than type 1 and type 2 diabetes, they still affect millions of people around the globe.